All right, welcome back. Great to have you with us for another deep dive.
Yeah, good to be here.
Today we're tackling something you shared, a really interesting topic.
Mm-hmm.
It's about acupuncture and, its potential role in fertility treatments, specifically IVF.
Exactly. In vitro fertilization, the big area.
And we're looking at this through the lens of, well, some specific research.
Right, a source you sent over. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis.
Published back in 2008 in the BMJ, a pretty respected journal.
Yes, by Eric Mannheimer and his colleagues.
So this wasn't just like one single experiment. They were pulling together findings from lots of studies, right?
That's the idea of a meta-analysis, yeah. They wanted to combine the data that was out there already.
And their goal, their mission with this paper was what exactly?
It was pretty clearly stated. They wanted to see if using acupuncture right around the time of the embryo transfer in IVF,
Okay.
if that could actually improve the chances, the key things. Clinical pregnancy, ongoing pregnancy, and ultimately a live birth.
Got it. So our mission today is really to unpack this specific 2008 paper.
Yeah.
What did it suggest back then, based on the evidence they gathered? Because, for anyone looking into fertility options or even just curious about how complementary medicine fits in, this seemed like it might have some surprising findings at the time.
It certainly presented some potentially impactful data based on what was available up to 2008. They aimed to evaluate acupuncture as an adjuvant therapy.
Adjuvant meaning like an add-on.
Exactly, an add-on to the standard IVF embryo transfer process.
Yeah.
They wanted to measure its effect objectively.
Okay, so how did they actually find the studies to include? Did they just search everywhere?
Pretty much. They did a systematic search, hitting the major medical databases, Medline, Embase, Cochrane Central.
The usual suspects.
Right. And even some specific Chinese databases, too. They were hunting for randomized controlled trials, RCTs.
Because those are the best kind for testing if something actually works, right? Random assigned.
Yeah, the gold standard. You randomly assign people to get the treatment or a control. It helps reduce bias.
Makes sense. And what were the groups being compared in these trials they found?
So they needed trials comparing actual needle acupuncture.
Real needles, real points.
Yes, given within 1 day, 24 hours before or after the embryo transfer. That was compared to control group.
And the control group could be?
It varied. Sometimes it was sham acupuncture, needles that don't really go in, or use non-acupuncture points.
Looks like the real thing, but isn't.
Kind of. Or the control group might have just had the standard IVF care with no extra treatment added.
Okay. And the main things they were measuring?
The outcomes were clinical pregnancy, ongoing pregnancy, meaning it progressed further, and of course, live birth, the ultimate goal.
Right. So how many studies actually fit the bill? How many did they end up combining?
They landed on 7 trials that met all their criteria.
7. Okay. And how many women involved in total?
Across those 7 trials, it was 1,366 women undergoing IVF.
Wow. Okay. Over 1,300. That's a decent number to pull together, especially for 2008.
It gave them a fairly robust data set for the time, yeah.
So the big question, when they crunched the numbers, combined the data from those 7 trials, what did it look like? What did the analysis suggest?
Well, this was the really significant part. The pooled data indicated that adding acupuncture around the embryo transfer was associated with a substantial increase in the odds of a positive outcome.
Okay, hang on. A substantial increase.
Yes.
In odds of pregnancy.
Yes, and it held across the main outcomes they looked at. Clinical pregnancy, ongoing pregnancy, and live birth.
Whoa, okay, now that's interesting. Can you give us a feel for how big an increase they reported? Like, what were the numbers?
Sure, they used odds ratios. So an odds ratio over 1 means higher odds in the acupuncture group.
Right.
For clinical pregnancy, the odds ratio was 1.65. For ongoing pregnancy, 1.87. And for live birth, it was 1.91.
So wait, 1.65 to 1.91. That means the odds were like, what, 65% to over 90% higher with acupuncture based on these studies?
Roughly, yes. Compared to the control groups in this specific set of 2008 studies, it suggested a pretty marked difference.
That does sound significant. They also mentioned something called the NNT, right? Number needed to treat. How does that help understand this?
Yeah, the NNT is super helpful, makes it more practical. It basically tells you how many patients you'd need to give the treatment to acupuncture, here to get one extra good outcome.
One outcome that wouldn't have happened without the treatment.
Exactly, compared to the control group. And in this 2008 analysis, the NNT for those key outcomes, clinical pregnancy, ongoing pregnancy, live birth, was around 9 or 10.
Okay, hold on. So Based just on this 2008 paper, you treat maybe 9 or 10 women with acupuncture around their transfer,
Mm-hmm.
and you'd expect to see about one additional pregnancy or live birth compared to if they hadn't had the acupuncture.
That's what the calculation suggested from their aggregated data, yes.
That makes the potential impact feel really concrete. You can picture it, a small group and potentially one extra success story according to this data.
It does provide that kind of practical estimate. But, and this is really important,
The caveats.
yes, the authors themselves were careful to point out the limitations in their own analysis.
Which is crucial for any research, obviously.
Yeah.
What were the main limitations they flagged back in 2008?
Well, one pretty big one was missing data. They couldn't get the complete live birth data for all 7 trials they included.
Okay. So the live birth analysis wasn't based on the full set of studies.
It was based on fewer studies than the clinical pregnancy analysis, yes, which weakens that specific finding a bit.
Makes sense. Any other limitations?
They also did some subgroup analyses, like looking only at trials where the control group already had a high success rate.
Okay.
And in that specific subgroup, the benefit of acupuncture wasn't as clear. It wasn't statistically significant anymore.
Interesting. So the overall picture looked positive, but when they sliced the data differently or noted missing info, it wasn't quite as consistent.
Exactly. The effect wasn't uniform across all ways of looking at it.
So these kinds of factors, they probably influenced how the authors worded their final conclusions.
Precisely. They were quite careful with their language.
So after all that analysis,
Mhm.
combining the studies, noting the limitations, what was the final takeaway message from Mannheimer and colleagues back in 2008?
Their conclusion, and they used the specific word, was that the current preliminary evidence
Preliminary. Okay.
Preliminary evidence suggested that acupuncture given around embryo transfer improves rates of clinical pregnancy, ongoing pregnancy, and live birth for women doing IVF.
Okay, let's try and sort of wrap this up then. This 2008 review, this meta-analysis, it looked at 7 trials,
Mm-hmm.
and it suggested that adding acupuncture right around the embryo transfer seemed linked to, well, significantly better odds for getting pregnant and having a baby based on that data pool.
Yes, that was the main finding. And it offered that practical metric, the NNT of about 9 or 10,
Right, potentially needing to treat 9 or 10 women for one extra positive result.
as calculated from those specific studies they analyzed.
And that NNT figure, that's a pretty memorable detail from this particular analysis, isn't it?
It really is, although again, as the authors stressed and as we've sort of walked through,
Yeah.
those limitations, the missing data, the subgroup results, they led them to explicitly call it preliminary evidence back then.
And preliminary evidence isn't the final word, is it? It's more like a signal.
Exactly. It's often a prompt for more research, a sign that something interesting might be going on, but it needs more investigation.
So for you listening, thinking about this,
Mm-hmm.
this kind of research shows more than just acupuncture and IVF, right? It's about how science looks at these complementary therapies.
Mhm.
What does it actually mean when studies get combined like this in a meta-analysis? What is preliminary evidence really telling us?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that shape what happens next?
Which raises that really compelling final thought, doesn't it? What actually needs to happen for something based on preliminary evidence, like the suggestion from this 2008 paper, to maybe move towards being standard practice? Or does it just lead to more studies that might confirm it or maybe refute it or just refine our understanding? How does future research build on these kinds of findings from, well, over a decade ago now?